Okay, so let's unpack this. Today we're doing a deep dive into historical interpretation, and we're focusing on one of the 20th century's most pivotal and, frankly, most misunderstood figures, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the Quaid-e-Azam of Pakistan.
Mm.
And for you listening, if you're trying to cut through decades of political rhetoric, all the historical noise, just to understand the truth of a leader this complex, this is your shortcut to clarity.
And clarity is absolutely the mission here. Our whole dive is anchored in the research of Zaheer Ahmad Meer from his really monumental work, Quaid-e-Azam of Pakistan.
Right.
And the mission it's anything but simple. We're trying to move beyond myths, as he puts it, to reclaim the archival truth and really restore Jinnah's rightful place among the great leaders of modern history.
You know, I find the background of the author Meer just incredibly compelling. He's not coming at this like a traditional academic historian.
No, not at all.
He is a constitutional and a corporate lawyer, a visionary, a social justice pioneer. And that background, that relentless focus on constitutional law and hard evidence, that's crucial to the book's entire argument, isn't it?
Oh, it fundamentally changes everything. The methodology is different. When a constitutional lawyer looks at history, the standards of proof just shift dramatically.
How so?
Well, you move away from just relying on, secondary interpretations or these emotionally charged stories. Instead, you focus on the primary evidence.
The actual documents.
The letters, the formal speeches, the constitutional proposals, the legislative record. Meer's core argument is that Jinnah was just historically misinterpreted, often for political convenience.
Or agenda-driven editing.
Exactly. And the only way to fight that is by using these rigorous, almost legal standards of archival evidence to show how these powerful, persistent myths just blurred the reality of his political life and his founding vision.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, lawyers are trained to look for consistency, for precedent, for intent. They're searching for the blueprint.
That's the word, the blueprint.
So this deep dive isn't about looking at Jinnah as some historical artifact we put on a shelf and label partition leader. It's about seeing him as a figure whose principles, whose dedication to law are maybe the most essential tools for navigating the future.
That is the core theme we have to hold on to. Jinnah's principles, especially about the supremacy of law, ethical governance, and the pursuit of justice, they go way beyond the politics of 1947.
They're timeless.
They are. And to really understand the man is to understand the sophisticated legal and moral scaffolding he insisted on building for a modern nation. That blueprint, according to Meer's work, is still waiting to be fully appreciated and maybe fully implemented.
So let's jump right into that first segment, the man and the multiplicity of myths. This is where it all gets so complex, because over the decades we've had so many contradictory, often weaponized labels attached to Jinnah that it's almost impossible to pin him down without this kind of archival work.
It's the classic problem of historical labeling. And it just shows how history, when it's oversimplified, can end up serving political agendas rather than the truth.
Right.
The source material notes that decades of historical work basically divided Jinnah into this collection of different faces, each one a partial truth and, more critically, a profound structural half-lie.
And the labels themselves are fascinating because they're so opposed to each other. I mean, on one hand, you have Jinnah, the ambassador of unity.
Right, which captures his early, really vigorous efforts inside the Indian National Congress to find common ground, to forge a unified path. He was a champion of Hindu-Muslim cooperation for years.
For years. But then, as the political situation changes, as his demands are rejected, the world eventually labels him the complete opposite. The apostle of division.
And you can see how just those two conflicting, emotionally loaded titles make any real analysis a challenge. If you only look at the ambassador, you see this pluralist. If you only look at the apostle, you see a rigid separatist. The truth, Meer argues, is in understanding the evolution between those 2 points. It wasn't a simple flip.
And the contradictions just keep coming. He was also widely labeled the liberal lawyer, reflecting his training in the British judicial system, his Western political style, his very polished secular lifestyle.
Yet, at the same time, he was called the Muslim nationalist, which implies this narrow, religiously motivated focus that seems to just completely contradict his liberal legal training.
So which one is it?
Well, the central issue, as Meer points out, isn't just that each label is only part of the story. It's that the insistence on using these simple binaries, liberal or nationalist, unity or division, it makes you miss the full complex picture of his principled legal evolution.
The labels become weapons.
They become tools for interpretation, not reflections of reality. They're useful for making a political point, but they're totally useless for historical truth.
Okay, so let's connect this to what the source calls the greatest tragedy. Zaheer Ahmad Meer says that Jinnah's greatest injustice wasn't the political opposition he faced in his lifetime.
which he handled with immense skill.
Right. But rather, the generational injustice of historical misinterpretation. Why is that worse? I mean, that's a really powerful claim.
It is, and the distinction is profound. Look, political opposition is temporary. It happens in the moment. It's about specific policies. Leaders expect it. They fight it. But historical misinterpretation, that's structural. It can be permanent until someone corrects the record.
And it distorts more than just tactics.
It fundamentally distorts the principle upon which he built the nation. It doesn't just judge what he did. It judges why he did it. And it usually gets the why completely wrong.
So if historians mistake a foundational constitutional principle for, say, just a political tactic, or even worse, some kind of reactionary move, what's the actual damage?
The damage is that future generations are denied access to the state's original blueprint. If you misunderstand the founders' intentions, especially when they're rooted in universal principles of law and justice, you misunderstand the nation's identity, its purpose.
It's like having the wrong map.
Exactly. Misinterpretation turns a living, applicable vision into a static, historical caricature. It strips it of all relevance for today's challenges. It stops the state from being able to measure itself against the moral standards its founder actually set.
That reframing really helps clarify why this work is so important. So, okay, let's reject the simple labels. Moving beyond this fanatic versus secularist dichotomy, what does the research actually define him as?
His true identity, according to this forensic dive into the archives, is that of a constitutional moralist.
A constitutional moralist.
Yes, and that is the aha. That phrase defines his whole philosophy. He wasn't driven by sectarian fervor, nor was he just operating in some Western secular vacuum.
Okay, help us unpack that term, constitutional moralist, because it feels so central. What does that actually mean for his political actions?
It means he was constantly connecting legal structure to an ethical outcome.
Yeah.
He understood that pure abstract morality, it's useless in governance unless it's written into law with enforceable rights and duties.
Right.
But on the flip side, law without a moral foundation just becomes arbitrary power. The constitutional moralist insists that the law must serve a higher ethical purpose.
And for Jinnah, that purpose was always
Justice, equality, and dignity for all groups. That legal structure ensures the pursuit of justice is orderly, predictable, and defensible, not just based on emotion.
And this leads us to the tool he used. The source says he employed law to humanize politics. That's a powerful idea, especially in that era of mass rallies and emotional appeals.
It's a huge idea. In the incredibly volatile world of pre-partition India, where politics often relied on whipping up mass emotion, Jinnah's method was completely distinct.
He was the lawyer in a room of protesters.
In a sense, yes. For him, law wasn't just a set of rules for lawyers to argue over. It was the essential ethical framework needed to ensure fairness, order, and predictability. When he was in negotiations, he always sought solutions that were legally sound, constitutional, and morally accountable.
Structure?
He was trying to instill structure where emotional chaos often reigned. He was using law to channel politics, to humanize it.
That definition, the constitutional moralist, it sets the stage perfectly for our second segment, the politics of historiography. Because once Jinnah was gone and partition was a reality, the narrative shaping began almost immediately.
Oh, in earnest. The method shows how different political groups actively shape Jinnah's image, often looking backward, to fit their own narratives and political needs.
And this part is so vital because it reveals the biases in history written by the victors or by those who are just trying to justify their own actions.
You see clear, distinct patterns in how Jinnah was framed, and it all depends on who is writing the history.
So let's start with the perspective of Indian historians, as mentioned in the source. They often painted him as this obstinate separatist, the man who ruined the dream of a united India. What are the long-term implications of that particular framing?
The implications are just profound because it personalizes a systemic constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
By making Jinnah the obstinate separatist, the narrative effectively ignores the severity of the constitutional issues that led to partition in the first place.
It makes it about one man's ego.
Exactly. It lets you dismiss his arguments about minority safeguards, about the failure of real power sharing, but the need for genuine federalism. They become personal whims rather than systemic political failures. This framing just strips the historical and constitutional wheat from the demands for justice that were at the heart of the Pakistan movement.
It makes the breakup seem like a personality clash, not a constitutional necessity.
Precise.
And then you have the Western writers. They didn't really help either, often just trying to simplify a really complex story for their own audience. The source says they often reduced him to just being the Muslim counterpart of Nehru.
That's historical shorthand at its most destructive.
Why? What's so damaging about that?
By calling him the counterpart, the Western narrative implies this simple, neat dichotomy: a Hindu leader versus a Muslim leader. It suggests Jinnah's entire political life was just a reaction to Nehru or the Congress Party.
That's not true.
Of course not. If you look at the archives, Jinnah was a successful political thinker and a legal giant long before the final push for separation. This counterpart label denies him his own agency, his originality, and the decades of independent political thought he demonstrated, especially in his constitutional proposals.
And what about the internal Pakistani discourse? The source suggests that even people who admired him sometimes fell short, simplifying his intellectual depth.
Yes. Yeah. In the passion of nation building, there was a tendency sometimes to simplify Jinnah by perhaps overemphasizing the religious identity of the new state, rather than the foundational judicial and ethical groundwork he insisted on.
So even in praise, they miss the point.
By simplifying him, even by accident, to fit an easier national myth, they contributed to the very misinterpretation Meer is arguing against. They risk turning him into a static icon rather than an active model for good governance.
So that context is so important. Okay, let's pivot now and contrast these biased portrayals with the authentic records, the archival truth. This is where we see the man restored.
And what's fascinating here is that the archival truth reveals a dramatically different man from the caricature. If you connect this to the bigger picture, the records confirm Jinnah was arguably the most consistent Democrat of his time in the subcontinent.
That is a very strong claim. Most consistent Democrat. In an era of shifting loyalties and revolutionary tactics, what in the source material really backs that up?
Well, consistency in this context is defined by his unwavering commitment across three core areas: equality, order, and justice.
Okay.
He pursued his political goals almost exclusively through constitutional means. He insisted on legal processes. He used legislative debates. He respected formal political systems. He didn't just resort to unstructured mass emotion or revolutionary violence, even when he was deeply frustrated.
So a Democrat uses the law to make change.
And a consistent Democrat insists on those same legal processes even when they work against his short-term goals. That was Jinnah.
But let me play devil's advocate here, because this is the question I'm sure you're thinking of. If he was so committed to consistency, to law, to unity, how do we reconcile that with the massive political shift? The move from demanding unity in the 1920s to demanding a separate state by the 1940s.
Right.
I mean, to many people, that looks like opportunism, or at best, a complete failure of his earlier ideals. This is where the source makes that crucial distinction: strategy versus betrayal.
And that is precisely the challenge Meer's research tackles head-on. The key distinction is this: Jinnah did not betray his ideals. He evolved his strategy to protect them.
Okay, say more about that.
His core ideal was always justice, equality, and dignity for all groups, especially politically vulnerable minorities. When he finally concluded, based on his reading of the political landscape, that those ideals could not be protected within a unified India, his strategy had to change.
So the goal securing justice, that stayed absolutely fixed, but the path to achieving it shifted from federal unity to sovereign separation.
Correct. When the constitutional structures that were supposed to guarantee minority rights failed to materialize or were constantly being undermined, the container, the unified state, was deemed insufficient to hold the contents, the principles of justice.
It changes the entire narrative.
It does. This distinction paints him not as an opportunist seeking power, but as a resolute, legally minded protector of foundational principles. He separated not for the sake of separation, but for the sake of justice.
That analysis really helps us understand the rationale. He adapted the container when the contents, his core principles, were threatened. Now, segment 3, evidence speaks. This is where we anchor that consistency in specific documented evidence. We need to trace this from, 1929 all the way to his last speech in 1948.
And the research meticulously does this. It identifies the consistency in Jinnah's philosophy by looking at key milestones, The sheer volume of material shows his political life wasn't erratic. It was a sustained commitment to legal solutions.
Okay, so let's start with his famous 14 points in 1929. These were a direct response to constitutional negotiations. For our audience, why are these points so significant?
They're hugely significant because they happened nearly 2 decades before partition became the final goal. This wasn't a separatist manifesto. It was a detailed legal framework for constitutional reform within a unified state.
So it was a plan for unity.
It was a plan for a workable, legally sound federal solution where minority interests were institutionally protected.
Can you give us a couple of concrete examples from the 14 points that show that commitment to constitutionalism and equality, rather than division?
Absolutely. One critical point was the demand for a uniform measure of autonomy for all provinces. This was crucial. It aimed to prevent a strong, centralized majority government from just steamrolling the smaller regional units.
A true federalist idea.
A hallmark of a federalist thinker distributing power legally, not just politically. Another key point demanded that no bill affecting a particular community should be passed unless 3/4 of the members of that community in the legislature agree to it.
A minority veto, essentially.
As a legal mechanism, a veto right designed to guarantee minority rights and security within the system. These points show a constitutional line trying to solve the problem of political power through legal safeguards, long before separation was even on the table.
So we see the blueprint being laid down in 1929, and the research argues that from those 14 points all the way to his last speech in 1948, that single unifying theme remained constant.
That constant theme is the pursuit of ethical governance rooted in the law. The central ideas are always the supremacy of law, moral accountability in governance, and equal citizenship for all.
These weren't just abstract ideas for him.
No, they were the architectural pillars of the state he envisioned. His final speeches just reiterated the duty of the state to uphold these very standards for every single citizen, regardless of their background.
The source also tells us that when Jinnah's speeches are read in their full context, his vision emerges not as one of division, but one of dignity through justice. What does that actually mean, dignity through justice?
It means that political separation was never the end goal in itself. It was purely a means to secure a moral environment. He understood that dignity, the inherent worth and self-respect of a person, can only exist where justice is legally guaranteed and morally respected.
If your rights can be taken away at any moment, you have no dignity.
Exactly. If a group feels their rights can be stripped away arbitrarily by a hostile political majority, dignity is impossible. So the movement for a separate state was a strategic necessity to ultimately secure justice, which is the prerequisite for collective dignity.
And this brings us to a critical distinction that, if you're listening, you really have to grasp. He stood for unity of rights, not uniformity of religion.
That distinction is paramount. It is everything to understanding the original vision for Pakistan.
Break that down for us.
Uniformity of religion implies a monocultural, maybe even a theocratic and restrictive state, focused on a single theological identity. Unity of rights, on the other hand, is a thoroughly liberal, democratic, and legal concept.
Okay.
It demands that every citizen, regardless of faith, ethnicity, or background, is guaranteed the exact same protections, responsibilities, and opportunities under the law. Jinnah's insistence on equal citizenship in his founding speeches aligns perfectly with this. The state belongs equally to all its people, defined by their rights, not their religion.
And if he was truly focused on unity of rights, that puts his famous speech from August 11th, 1947, where he talked about religion being a private matter for the individual, into sharp context.
It's the sharpest context possible. That speech is the most powerful evidence of the constitutional moralist at the very moment of the state's birth. He wasn't setting up a theocracy. He was setting up a state defined by law and equal protection for all.
And the vision wasn't just internal, was it?
No, not at all. The research emphasizes it had a massive global ambition, confirmed by that powerful declaration he made. In course of time, you will see that Pakistan will become one of the greatest nations of the world.
What does that phrase, one of the greatest nations, imply when we view it through this lens of constitutional moralism?
The focus here isn't on being the biggest or the strongest militarily, but on achieving global standing. Greatness implies several things: political stability, economic potential, and, critically, international moral authority.
You don't become great by being unjust at home.
A nation doesn't become great globally by being inward-looking or unjust to its own people. It becomes great by having a robust, functioning, and universally respected system of law and governance. He was envisioning a global player, suggesting a long-term vision of responsibility and influence on the world stage, rooted entirely in those moral and legal foundations.
So the vision was grand, and its potential greatness was built on the supremacy of law and justice, not the supremacy of any single identity.
Precisely. The greatness he envisioned had to come from the practice of justice and equality that he championed, making Pakistan a model state, not just another state.
Okay, so we've broken down the myths, we've anchored his true identity in the archives, and we've established the long-term consistency of his principles. Now in segment 4, we move to restoring the historical Jinnah. The research synthesizes all of this into a comprehensive 3-part definition of the restored leader.
And this restoration is crucial for anyone trying to apply his legacy today. Modern research, including Meer's work, clarifies that Jinnah has to be recognized through 3 integrated, inseparable roles.
Okay, what are they?
First, a constitutional jurist. Second, a moral statesman. And third, a visionary nation builder.
Let's dedicate some time to defining each one. Starting with the constitutional jurist. This speaks to his profession, obviously, but also his entire method of political action.
Right. The jurist identity highlights his lifelong commitment to the rule of law. For Jinnah, governance was a legal problem that needed to be solved, not just a political battle to be won. Everything, from negotiating independence to structuring the new government, was seen through a legal lens.
So the law came first?
Always. He knew that rights and responsibilities have to be written down, enshrined in law to last. They can't just rely on temporary political goodwill or the whim of a leader. As a jurist, his first commitment was to the framework itself.
The second identity is the moral statesman. This one really clashes with that image of the obstinate, ego-driven leader that his opponents often painted.
It does. It acts as the bridge, connecting his legal method to his ethical goal. As a moral statesman, he acted not for personal ambition or for popularity, but based on a moral obligation to protect the rights of the politically vulnerable. That was a cause he championed, even when it cost him political alliances.
So morality dictated the goal, and law dictated the means.
Perfectly put. Morality dictated the end of just society. The law dictated the means, a constitutional and orderly transition. He was a statesman because he prioritized long-term stability and fairness over short-term political wins.
And finally, the visionary nation builder. This role seems to encompass that legacy we just discussed, aiming for global stature and moral authority.
It synthesizes the other two. The jurist provided the legal tools, the statesman provided the integrity and moral direction, and the nation builder had the foresight to establish principles that would sustain a modern, complex state far beyond his own lifetime. He was building permanent legal infrastructure for the future, not just solving the immediate problem of 1947.
This composite portrait lets us deconstruct his leadership style and contrast it with the myths. The source details 3 key characteristics that defined his rational approach.
First, his leadership was decisively rational, not reactionary. In moments of extreme tension and pressure like the final days of negotiation, he was guided by logic, evidence, and constitutional process. He was calculating, measured, and consistently avoided the emotional, visceral reaction in favor of the calculated, legally sound response.
But let me challenge that for a second, because a lot of historical critiques would point to the violence and chaos of partition and say, how rational was that? They'd argue a truly rational leader should have foreseen that and mitigated it better.
That is a crucial challenge, and Meer addresses it by distinguishing between the rationale for the political decision and the failure of implementation by the structures around him. Jinnah's decision to separate was based on a rational, legal assessment that constitutional security for minorities had collapsed. That rational decision itself didn't cause the violence. The violence was the result of a breakdown of law and order, administrative collapse, and the rapid, unprepared division of resources and security forces.
So his rational decision was overtaken by irrational events.
His dedication to law was meant to prevent chaos. But when the entire administrative infrastructure dissolved around him, the rational decision for sovereignty was tragically overtaken by human events far outside his control.
That's an essential distinction for fairness. Okay, second characteristic. His faith was spiritual, not sectarian.
This is fundamental to his unity of rights principle. His personal faith was clearly a deeply private source of morality and strength. It informed his ethical framework, but, and this is critical, it was never weaponized for political exclusion.
His spirituality informed his ethics, but didn't define the state's laws.
Precisely. His constitutional vision was inherently inclusive, which is why he could so passionately defend the rights of non-Muslim citizens as equal citizens in the new nation.
And finally, his politics were inclusive, not exclusionary.
And this is the practical outcome of the first 2 points. By being rational and spiritually grounded rather than sectarian, his political structure had to be inclusive. His goal was to secure dignity and participation for all citizens. Exclusionary politics rely on mobilizing identity differences. Jinnah's stated political foundation relied on unifying rights guarantees.
Zaheer Ahmad Meer offers this profound mandate for historians based on all this. History's duty is not to flatter, but to be fair. I want to linger on that for a moment. Why is fairness, especially with a nation's founding figure, so much harder for history to achieve than just simple flattery?
Because flattery is easy. Flattery reinforces the comfortable national stories we like to tell ourselves. It simplifies complexity into heroism. It caters to national pride or serves a current political need.
It feels good.
It feels good. Fairness, however, is intellectually demanding. It requires the historian to grapple with contradictions, to acknowledge shifts in strategy while rigorously preserving core principles, and most difficultly, to use evidence to actively challenge those comfortable national myths.
It requires intellectual honesty.
Honesty above political utility. And that can be a very painful task for a nation to undertake. It means accepting the complexity of their founders' journey and the tragic circumstances that surrounded their success.
And the ultimate connection the source makes is just incredibly powerful. It sums up the entire thesis. To write Jinnah is to write justice, for he built Pakistan on both law and justice.
That sentence is the absolute essence of Meer's analysis. Jinnah's life's work was dedicated to securing justice for a people, and the vehicle he chose for that work was, consistently, the law. So writing his true story, the story of the constitutional moralist, is the same as acknowledging the foundational, paramount role of justice and the rule of law in Pakistan's very existence.
If you neglect the law, you miss the man.
And if you neglect justice, you miss the entire purpose.
Okay, moving into our final segment, Jinnah's living legacy and practical application. So, if the historical restoration is complete, the crucial next question for you listening is, what does this foundational vision mean for us today in modern governance?
Right. The source argues his enduring relevance comes from his ability to transform these abstract concepts into actionable institutional principles.
He made them real.
That's the definition of effective constitutional leadership. He didn't just talk about lofty ideals, he codified them. He transformed law into liberty by providing a constitutional structure that guarantees individual freedoms against an overreaching state. And critically, he transformed faith into fairness.
Let's explore that second one more, transforming faith into fairness. It means rejecting a purely secular state, but also rejecting a theocracy.
It implies a state that is fundamentally moral, ethical, just, and equitable, without being confessionally restrictive. Fairness is the moral outcome. If your ethical belief system says you must treat others justly and protect the vulnerable, then the state apparatus has to be designed to enforce that fairness for everyone.
So it's the practical application of the constitutional moralist.
Exactly. Using the legal system to enforce ethical obligations that might come from a spiritual perspective, but applying them to all citizens equally.
And this speaks directly to the nature of the great nation he envisioned. The source describes Pakistan as being envisioned as a moral power, not just military or economic, but fundamentally ethical.
This is a profound and maybe a challenging idea for any modern state. A military power commands resources and maybe fear. An economic power commands capital. But a moral power, it commands respect and influence through its integrity, its institutional strength, and its unwavering adherence to justice and internal equality.
So Pakistan's greatest strength was meant to be its character.
Jinnah intended for Pakistan to be an ethical force on the global stage, a model of justice for the Muslim world and for humanity at large. This means the nation's greatest strength was supposed to come from the excellence of its governance and the profound equality of its society, not just its defense budget or its GDP.
That sets the bar incredibly high. If that's the vision, a moral power, how does anyone in governance or just in civil society today contribute to that living legacy? Zaheer Ahmad Meer's ultimate conclusion is forceful. The greatest tribute to Jinnah is not to praise him, but to practice him.
And that is the ultimate call to action. That's what makes him relevant today. To practice him means translating the principles of the constitutional moralist into daily governance and civic life.
Moving beyond the speeches and the portraits.
Moving beyond rhetoric and into actionable policy. The source defines what this practice means across 3 indispensable principles: honesty in governance, equality in opportunity, and dignity for all citizens.
Let's break down the practical application of those three pillars, because this is where history meets today's reality. First, honesty in governance.
Honesty in governance means transparency, unwavering accountability, and a radical rejection of corruption. This is the moral accountability Jinnah championed. Corruption undermines the supremacy of law because it lets personal interest override constitutional fairness.
So practicing Jinnah means fighting corruption.
It means establishing robust legal mechanisms to ensure leaders operate with integrity, that public resources serve the public, and that the rule of law applies to everyone equally.
Next, equality and opportunity. This sounds like a deliberate rejection of nepotism, elitism, and institutional bias.
It speaks directly to that unity of rights. Equality of opportunity means dismantling systemic barriers. It's about guaranteeing that every citizen, regardless of their socioeconomic status, their religion, their region, has the legal and institutional infrastructure to succeed based on merit, not connections.
If the law favors the powerful, the whole vision collapses.
It's destroyed, and Jinnah's vision of a great nation is undermined.
And finally, dignity for all citizens. This seems like the ultimate ethical outcome, the capstone of the vision.
It is the ethical measure of success. Dignity is secured when citizens fundamentally trust that their rights are protected, that the law is supreme, and that they will be treated fairly and respectfully by the state. It means citizens can approach their government with confidence, not with fear.
It closes the circle.
It does. Jinnah sought dignity through justice. And practicing his principles today, honesty, equality, is the only way to ensure that dignity is real and non-negotiable for everyone, thereby fulfilling the founding promise of the nation.
This analysis provides such profound context. We've moved Jinnah from a dusty political figure to a constitutional jurist whose principles are alive and challenging us today.
Absolutely. The living legacy isn't some inheritance of past glory. It's a relentless demand for current accountability. The source compels us to judge the nation not by how loudly it praises its founder, but by how faithfully it adheres to the universal legal and moral principles he insisted upon.
So we've reached the end of this deep dive, guided by the research of Zaheer Ahmad Meer. And I think we've successfully moved beyond those contradictory labels, the apostle of division, the ambassador of unity, and found the unwavering man of integrity, driven by the principles of law and justice.
And the key shift in understanding for you, the learner, is realizing that Jinnah's lifelong goal was always the supremacy of law and justice, not just separation for its own sake. Separation was the strategy, the necessary legal structure to achieve that fundamental principle of justice, but only after all other constitutional paths were exhausted.
He was a constitutionalist to the very end.
And that must be the defining feature of his legacy.
And the work of Meer helps us see Jinnah not as a historical artifact, but as the constitutional jurist, the moral statesman, and the visionary nation-builder he truly was, setting a standard for ethical, legal governance that remains intensely relevant and challenging today.
So as we reflect on this deep dive, let's circle back to that idea of an ongoing ethical responsibility. The source argues that Jinnah built the nation on law and justice, aspiring to create an ethical model for humanity, a moral power.
Right.
So the true tribute is to practice him, to enforce honesty in governance, equality in opportunity, and dignity for all. What does it imply about the health of a society today when the very legal and moral principles insisted upon by its founder at its inception are the very ideals it still struggles daily to achieve? It suggests that the nation-building project, based on these universal timeless principles, isn't a finished historical event. It's an ongoing, essential ethical responsibility that demands consistent practice and dedication from every citizen every day. That's the final thought we want to leave you with. Practice, not praise.